Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show.
You meet someone online and there's this instant connection. It's amazing how much the two of you just seem to click. They live somewhere far away and there's some plausible reason they can't travel to meet you. They tell you they're in love with you and you feel optimistic for the first time in a long time. They have a successful career, yet somehow they need money from you to solve a short-term problem, always with the promise of paying you back. Time goes on and they need more money more urgently. You've started to see the cracks and begin to wonder whether they've been lying this whole time. All of a sudden it hits you. You've been scammed. Fool Me Twice is the story of my mother, Jules Hannaford, a woman who was drawn into the dangerous world of sweetheart scams. After a trip overseas to meet a stranger, a dangerous altercation in a Manchester hotel room, and thousands of pounds lost for good, she's here to tell her story. Fool Me Twice, a true crime podcast, is available on Apple Podcasts, Ozcast Network, and anywhere you listen to your podcasts.
Today I'm here with Arun Kiran. Hi Arun, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, hi, Jules. It's a pleasure to be on the show, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. That you're the first geneticist I've had on the show, so that's
Yes. I mean, it's a pleasure to actually be on a show where it's so diverse, especially I see that the kind of topic that you talk about is very different. And I thought it's a nice idea to actually also bring awareness amongst your users and also the listeners who are actually trying to understand maybe how genetics can help them in different ways. So
yeah, I'm fascinated. It was great researching it. I learned a lot already and I'm excited to learn more by talking to you because there's a lot that I didn't know about. It's going to be really interesting. Arun, why did you decide to get into the field of genetics?
It's actually a very interesting story because I wanted to be a doctor, but I realized like one of the times when I was doing my bachelor's degree, I had to do like an autopsy. And then that's when I realized maybe this is not a field for me. Maybe I just picked up because I felt, it's something I can really learn a lot. But I felt I was more scared of the whole profession. So that's why I thought, okay, maybe I should explore some other avenues in the same field of science. And that's when I looked up into different subsets of science. Like, biology was very interesting for me and I wanted to learn more about it. Eventually, I got more inclined towards it. And that's when I got into applied genetics. That's where I did my bachelor's. And then I did my master's in human genetics. It got more specialized eventually. And then I started to work more in clinical settings and where I could really have an impact on people's lives. And that's when I found that I got my purpose. Just being a doctor, maybe I could also do something more similar by giving some information which could be very valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's more valuable than I realized from my research, and all of that will unfold during this interview. You actually provide genetic counseling for Pre-Genetics Limited and CircleDNA. Are these two different companies that you work for?
So basically the company's name is Prenetics, the parent company, and the brand CircleDNA is part of it, which is like a direct-to-consumer company where people can actually go to the website and buy the DNA test from online, and it gets pretty much delivered to them. And this is something where people can have direct access to DNA testing because in certain settings, it's not really something where people can go and directly buy. You have to go to a physician and you have to go to a hospital or a clinic to get a DNA test. So it is very different in terms of the audience. And that's the reason why we wanted to give access to the end user to buy any kind of test that they really want to. That's the reason why. Yeah.
So you're moving with the times because everything's going online, isn't it?
Exactly.
So you guys are getting ahead of the game by putting it online. And we'll talk a little bit more about how CircleDNA differs from other companies later in the interview.
Yes.
But first of all, tell me a bit about what is genetic counseling and do you specialize in any particular area?
In terms of understanding the field, I would say the best way to put it across is by helping people understand what are the different genetic disorders that they could be impacted or their family members could be impacted. And the whole process is basically dealt by the genetic counselors who are well trained and who are professionals who have been having expertise in the genetic field. And that's the reason why we are someone who will help them to assess the risk associated with the health conditions and also certain inherited forms of conditions which could be passed on from one generation to another, and also what are the different limitations and risk factors associated with it. And we try and deduce the risk assessment part of the certain conditions and also help them understand what are the different ways to try and mitigate the overall risk from a certain condition per se, and also what kind of treatments are available. It's like the whole process of helping them from the very get-go on how to understand what conditions might be, something they might be predisposed to or their children might be, and how they can avoid it and how potentially they can also treat it if they can get to know well in advance. So all of this process is pretty much dealt by the genetic counselors. We also deal with the psychological aspect if certain conditions are very traumatic, right? In the sense if they are someone who are at higher risk, it definitely increases a lot of anxiety amongst them. And that's the reason why we also help them in that process and help them understand why having a mutation not necessarily means you will get the condition. It's about how you can help them to understand it's a risk factor and how you can try and reduce it. It depends from different settings. I can eventually, in the process, help you with those settings as well.
You work across the board in all the different areas of the genetic counseling.
Definitely. I mean, most of the counselors, they try to focus on one aspect. And I mean, it totally depends on what kind of setting they are in. Since I'm working in this direct-to-consumer setting, my field is very diverse. So I work on cancer genetics, I work on family planning, and I work on different kind of conditions which could be lifestyle-based, but also have a genetic component to it. There are multiple, I would say, facets to this, and which is something that I'm trying to deal. But most of the counselors, they try to focus on one area. They are in a clinic or in a hospital. They try to work either on the prenatal genetic testing or on specific kind of cancer testing. It's very much specialized based on the counselor's expertise, what they must have been trained with. And in my case, I've done all of that, but I wanted to do something more across the board.
So that's cool. So I was amazed when I was looking through the CircleDNA website at the variety of genetic testing that can help people. And you've mentioned a few here with the family planning and the cancer genetics indicators and things like that. Can you just give me a bit more of an idea of some of the areas that are offered and how testing can impact a person's life?
Yeah, sure, definitely. I think one of the best examples for cancer, you can understand what are the different risks that you might have for inherited cancers, because 5 to 10% of cancers that are globally affecting people are due to hereditary causes. And that's where we tend to help people understand whether they have any genetic mutation which might potentially increase the risk of certain inherited forms of cancers. Now, there are certain cancers which are passed on from one generation to another, and that's what is called as inherited cancers. Now, these are the ones that we can actually test based on the genes that could potentially be associated with these cancers. Definitely, nowadays, we have found out that it's not only necessary that your family history is very strong in cancer. You don't need to have a family history in order to actually have a genetic mutation. That's where a key differentiating factor is. That's the reason why we want to give access to the community so that they can buy the test. Even if they have a mutation, they can definitely be well ahead in the times by doing certain screenings. In terms of, let's say, for breast cancer, they can start early mammography or early breast MRI before the condition actually hits. And even if it hits at the early stage 1 is very easily treatable. So many of the cancers, many people, they don't even get to know about the symptoms until it's stage 3 or 4. And by then it's too late. You really can't do anything because the overall cancer have progressed across the whole system and the cells have pretty much been spread. These are the main avenues I feel where genetics can add as a tool. And of course, the utility is very diverse. So coming to another aspect, which is family planning. Here we can actually understand what are the conditions which could be passed on from your, let's say, parents to that of the child by understanding the overall genetics of the individual person who is getting tested and their partner as well. These are the main things that you can get to know based on the overall genes that we are looking for and how you can also avoid them. So all of these are basically totally on the amount of research that has been done and also the genetic conditions and what's the association with the different genes.
What's the benefit of knowing that you have a predisposition to inherited forms of cancer? Like you mentioned that you can have
Yeah.
early screening and early
Yeah.
testing. Is there
Right.
any other benefits? Like can you change your lifestyle to avoid getting it or
Oh, yes.
yeah?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I would say generally in cancer risk perspective, if you see 80 to 90% is actually environmental, which many people don't really know about
No,
because
I didn't know that.
yeah, yeah, so that's the massive percentage if you look at it. And the main causal factors, of course, smoking, alcohol consumption, and also exposure to UVA and UVB rays, which is, going out in the sun also can actually increase the risk of melanoma or other kind of skin cancers as well. And then there are a lot of toxins which are present in our daily life. For example, the ones which are present in air purifiers or even insecticidal sprays which we use in our house, all of them are having certain toxins which long-term exposure can actually increase the risk of cancers as well. You need to be using those organic perfumes or any kind of certain agents which are not going to be chemically affecting your overall system. So all of these factors definitely can increase the cancer risk. And these are the ones which are called acquired mutations. So what I mean is if somebody is smoking, let's say across their life for at least 10 years, 20 years, they can definitely have an increased risk for lung cancer. And for some people who have been drinking alcohol, they have liver cancer. But this is not only cancers that they might be exposed to, but there are also other cancers which we don't even know how the root cause could be. But definitely 80 to 90% is environmental, and it could be anything from pollution to excess amount of exposure to certain chemicals, or even obesity, or even any kind of lifestyle conditions if they already have type 2 diabetes. It could eventually also lead to other comorbid factors which indeed could lead to cancer risk as well. That's the reason why not only knowing the mutation, but also knowing what are the other risk factors which could trigger the response is also very important for the people to know about it.
Yeah, because as you said, even if you have the mutation, it doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily mean you will get the cancer. You can limit your risk of it by all of these other things that you just talked about, which is so
Exactly.
interesting. What about the anxiety and the mental health issues that can come
Right.
along with knowing, or that living in fear? Like, how do you
Yes.
overcome that?
Yeah, definitely it's a challenge. And I would say that many people have a different tendency to deal with it. Some people might actually not feel that bad and they will be like, okay, it is what it is, but I'm going to take things into my hand and I will try and make sure that I keep myself more healthy. I keep eating something which is not going to, increase my risk for cancer. And at the same time, try and make sure to do constant screenings at a very frequent duration. This is one way to look at it. And some people, of course, they get really anxious and they think, okay, I'm pretty much going to get the cancer. But that's not the case. So that's where I feel a genetic counselor helps to bridge this communication and helps them to understand, this is not something it's going to, completely change your whole life. It's something that you can take into your own hands and make certain actions that will help you to avoid severe circumstances in future.
I read somewhere that women going through menopause, after menopause, they can be, if they drink and smoke and have a difficult lifestyle, they can be more at risk of getting cancers than before
Yes.
menopause. Is that true?
I mean, I would say in general, actually having exposure to any kind of these certain external factors will definitely increase the cancer risk. And as we grow older, definitely our immune system is much weaker. That's why when you tend to start, doing these kind of external things like smoking or alcohol consumption, definitely the risk is much higher for sure. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. And what about genetic testing? You talked a little bit about that. Is that to make sure that the genes of both parents, when they come together, are not going to produce a negative impact on the baby in some way? Is that what
Right.
it is?
Genetic testing, I mean, it is very different in terms of different cases, how you actually come across. So, for example, let's say for cancer, right? We do testing for around 140 genes. which could potentially increase the risk of inherited forms of cancers, like 36 cancers we screen for. And if somebody has a mutation, either they got it from the parents or they actually happen to have the mutation during the reproduction process. There is a certain kind of changes that happen, which can also lead to a mutation in the individual. So these are the two different scenarios where it could lead to a genetic mutation. We tend to look for these specific genes and we try and see if they have a specific mutation, which could potentially increase cancers for across the board for certain conditions. And then we tell them, okay, how frequently they need to be starting the screening, how frequently they need to meet their physician and try and understand if there are any other potential ways to reduce the risk, because there are certain drugs also available. For example, if somebody has a mutation in this one gene called BRCA1, which is also the same mutation which Angelina Jolie had.
Yeah, I was going to mention her. Yeah.
Yeah.
She had a complete mastectomy.
Mastectomy, exactly.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a very, I would say, a strong family history, which she had because her maternal aunts as well as her mother. So this is a syndrome which is called as hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome. Part of that, there are many genes along with BRCA genes, which I mentioned, BRCA1 and BRCA2. There are even other set of genes which could also increase the risk. We look for all these mutations and then we also tell them if any certain drugs can actually help them to reduce the risk. For example, taking tamoxifen. So this is a very common drug which is generally prescribed, especially people who have the mutation, and it can actually reduce the underlying risk as well. And then there are certain birth controls which are also known to reduce the risk. So all these different factors along with screenings and all of them can definitely help the individual get to know about their existing risk, and also if they can try and catch the diagnosis at a very early stage.
How can genetic testing help with family planning?
Oh, sure. The conditions that we tend to look for are basically following an inheritance pattern, which is called as autosomal recessive. Now, what it means is that, there are conditions which will get passed on provided both the couples have the mutation in the same gene. What I mean is, let's say somebody got tested and they tend to have a mutation in one of the genes, and then their partner also has a mutation in the same gene. Only then the condition will get passed on to the child with a 25% risk. This is one of the probability. And the second probability is where the child will be a carrier. And carriers are the ones who inherit only like a single copy of a mutation. And people who are generally carriers will not exhibit any symptoms or they have no implication whatsoever on their medical care. Carriers are someone who will just carry the mutation, but it is very relevant, especially when they are planning for a family. They need to make sure that their partner does not carry a mutation in the same gene. This is one of the aspects. And the third scenario is where 25% chance where the child will not inherit any mutation, which is basically like a normal sequence, no problem at all. There are three different scenarios. The first scenario is where it's very much helpful, where people can understand whether the child has any risk. And 25% possibility is where the child could be affected. And when there is a chance of, let's say, even 25%, it's actually a high percentage if you look at it, because the child, if he gets affected with any of the family planning condition, then it could be very worse for the parents, because it's not only about the financial part of it, but also it's very hard on the overall care for the kid, because some of the kids can even die at a very young age, even 1 or 2 years old. These are the reasons why family planning can help you well in advance. What are the potential risks that the child could actually be inheriting?
You see sometimes potential parents making the decision not to have children based on the risk factors.
Not really, because there is a lot of solutions that actually one could do. So let's say for the first scenario, which I mentioned, if they tend to have mutations in the same gene, both the parents, they can actually do something called as IVF. IVF basically it's in vitro fertilization. But on top of that, there is an interesting technology which has been around from quite a few years, which is called as PGS, which is known as pre-implantation genetic screening. What they do is, when in the process of IVF, a mother basically releases n number of eggs because they are hormonally injected. When they actually screen for these eggs, they find out if there is any kind of DNA mutations present in either of the eggs. And the one which do not have any of the mutation are the ones which are put back into the mother's womb. So this way you can totally avoid the condition from being passed on to the child.
Oh,
So,
that's a relief. So good to know. Yeah, that's great. It is really worth doing then.
Yeah, exactly.
Avoid
Definitely.
having those difficult situations once you've given birth. Oh, that's really cool. Following on from that, should all people have prenatal testing, or should they just have it if they have some sort of concern or worry or family history with problem?
There are two aspects of prenatal testing is when an individual is actually pregnant and they want to know if there is any underlying risk for the child during the pregnancy process. Now, family planning is a little different. This is kind of a testing which you do well before you actually start for a family. In terms of prenatal testing, it's very helpful to actually understand and let's say validate the factor that if the child or the fetus is actually healthy, because there are other conditions which need to be done during the pregnancy stage. For example, there is certain kind of maternal serum screening, which a lot of hospitals do, which everybody goes through it. And then there are certain kind of other tests which they also do to find out if the child is at high risk for Down syndrome or any of the other conditions like Patau syndrome. There are other chromosomal anomalies or abnormalities which could actually happen. And those are the ones which could only be found during prenatal genetic testing. And that's the reason why a genetic counselor can actually help them go through the process along with the physician to help them have a baby which is pretty much going to be healthier. This is one of the ways for prenatal.
Okay, cool. And I was surprised that genetic testing can help people lose weight and get healthy. How does that work?
Yes, so this is very interesting as well because there are a lot of studies that have been published in the community, and these are called as genome-wide association studies. So what they do is they look at two set of group of peoples where one group is actually morbidly obese and another group is not. And the ones which are actually obese, they tend to sequence them. They do DNA testing. And then they see what are the specific genetic markers which are actually driving the risk of obesity. And then when they get to know about this, then we pretty much know that there is some underlying mechanism which is actually affecting them in a way that the fat metabolizing effect in the system is very slow because they are not able to effectively metabolize the fat in the system, which indeed leads to deposition of adipose fat and which leads to obesity. When an individual gets to know from the genetics that they have a higher predisposition, you can actually make changes from your diet and also your fitness more oriented towards specific ways to cut down on the fat amount or any kind of food sources which are really high on saturated fats or trans fats. These people have to be more cautious. And that's one of the ways to try and personalize so that they can not be obese in future.
Okay, that's so interesting. Then you can guide them onto specific diets that work specifically for them.
Exactly. Because
so cool.
Because genetics is very unique to yourself. Even though 99.9% all of us have same DNA, right? But there is only 0.1% which is very different to each individual. And that's what makes us so unique in the sense of our eye color, our hair color, our predisposition to certain health conditions. So all of this is embedded inside those 0.1%, which is what makes us unique and which is what will guide us to what kind of diet is more effective for us, what kind of fitness would be more effective for us. Because some people, they hit gym irrespective of how many days whatsoever, and they still do not lose weight. Maybe that's where DNA testing can actually help them to personalize the overall fitness activities in a way that they can burn fat effectively. All of this is, pretty much.
This has got to be a popular one. I'm sure it's got to be a popular one. I was reading on your website that you can test brain health and discover if somebody will get dementia. Isn't this just sad news because there's no cure for dementia and then you live with the fact that you know that it's coming? Isn't it better not to know? And then when you get dementia, maybe you don't even know you have dementia?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say there is different ways to look at it. It does affect some people in terms of their overall anxiety levels. But I would say there are certain conditions like dementia or Alzheimer's. All of them, of course, they do not have any treatment at this point of time. But what you can understand based on the genetic mutations is that you might have an increased predisposition or increased risk for these different neurological conditions. And when you get to know about this, you can actually take preemptive measures in terms of your diet, in terms of your lifestyle, in terms of other factors, like, for example, Alzheimer's. If somebody has a mutation in this one of this gene, which we test for, it's called ApoE. If they have a single copy of a mutation, then they have a moderate risk, which almost increases their risk by 33%. And if somebody has a two copy of a genetic mutation, then they have an elevated risk, which increases their lifetime risk by almost 48%, which is very high. Doesn't necessarily mean that if you don't have treatment, you cannot do anything, because all of these conditions are highly preventable. Now, that's pretty much known factor.
Are they?
Yeah. So, for example, Alzheimer's, you can actually prevent yourself by making certain lifestyle changes. For example, one of them is doing regular physical exercise can actually cut down the risk by up to 50%, which is massive.
Wow. Yeah.
So
that's
all of this,
huge.
yeah, you can do that. Yeah, that's a huge percent, exactly.
And I suppose not smoking and drinking or taking drugs and things like that would help as well, wouldn't it? And then doing brain exercises like Sudoku and things like that.
Right. So brain stimulation, mental stimulation is very important, because they have done an interesting study by the NIH, which is the National Institute of Health, where they have done a study with two groups of people. When they saw that one group of people who did mental stimulation training, for example, engaging themselves in many brain-related activities, which could basically be any kind of games, as well as Sudoku, board games, Scrabble. As long as you're, indulging in some brain-related activity, they saw that not only they formed new neuronal connections, but their cognitive efficiency increased really high compared to other groups. And then they saw that their overall memory has been lasting for more than 10 years or so. So this is something very interesting, because Alzheimer's, again, is a condition where your brain starts to decline. Your memory is something also is going to be on the lower side. All of this can be prevented if you take all these preventive actions. So
that's so interesting. And like my nan is 102 years old.
Oh,
and
wow.
she always did the cryptic crossword her whole life. And she's still as sharp as a tack at 102.
There you go.
That's got something to do with it.
Exactly.
And I was also so interested to see that genetic testing can help with sleep. Now, I need this. I have, since I hit menopause, I have terrible trouble with sleep. And I'm wondering, how does this work and how can I get this test?
I would say it basically tells you whether you're an early bird or you're someone who is more of a night sleeper, right? This is something that can differentiate based on the genetic markers, because underlying science is that your circadian rhythm is pretty much driven by certain genes. Because some people, they are really active during the night and some people are very active during the day. I think when you get to know about these different categories on where you fall into, you can actually personalize your lifestyle based on that. And you can plan in a way that most of your things which you need to do, let's say for work, you can focus on how much productivity you can get during what time intervals. And this way you can more focus on it. It's not gonna
it's not going to help me sleep better.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, I'm not getting it. Forget
it. Right. So it's about how you can plan and make it more beneficial for you. And at the same time, because end of the day, everybody wants to get good sleep. Some people have trouble and some people are insomniac and so on. I would definitely say there are other ways that you can always try and look into, but genetics is not going to give you a solution how to sleep. But yes, it will tell you the main thing, like where you might fall in.
Yeah, that's interesting, but annoying. Why do you think overall it's important to raise awareness of genetic testing with the public as a useful thing to prevent certain things and mitigate the associated risk factors?
Definitely, I think it's very important for the overall community as such to try and look into genetic testing, because the field is very vast and the utility is very vast as well. So you can do cancer testing, as I mentioned earlier, family planning. You can also do certain prenatal testing as well. And then you can also look into a new field, which is called as pharmacogenomics, where you can actually understand what kind of drugs will be more effective for you well in advance, rather than going through the secondary applications or side effects. So all of this information.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that is definitely interesting, because many people when they start taking certain medications, they go through a lot of side effects which they don't necessarily have to go through, because existing healthcare system doesn't have this ability to find out whether they might be someone who actually can experience side effects well in advance. So that's where genetics plays a role, to give them then access to understand what is the underlying metabolizing effect of the liver, and try and use this information so that they can pretty much personalize their drug regime from the very beginning. Yeah.
Wow, I had no idea about that. That's amazing.
Yes.
What it says on your website that a client can have a complimentary genetics consultation. What does that involve?
If an individual person who has done the genetic testing and they tend to have an increased risk for, let's say, different conditions across the report, for, let's say, for brain related conditions or for cancer or for family planning, all of them will be explained very much in detail by the genetic counselor and what they need to be doing. And there will also be an overall summary report, which will basically be focusing on what are the different risk factors, what are the ways to try and limit your risk, and how you can actually keep doing certain screenings, and also what are the things that you need to discuss with your physician about. All of this information will be pretty much explained in detail, that the client can actually talk or have a discussion with their physician.
That's interesting, because I misunderstood that. I thought it was an initial counselling, but it's actually after you've done the testing. You pay for the test, you do the test, and then you get this complimentary session where it's all kind of explained and broken down. That's super helpful. What are the platforms that are used for doing the genetic test, and what's the difference between a genetic test from companies like 23andMe, Ancestry.com compared to CircleDNA?
I think there is a huge differentiating factor, because a lot of these companies like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, they have a very niche kind of a product, in the sense like they only look for ancestry, or they only look for certain aspects of the traits like eye color, hair color, and so on. And they are only doing it for very less amount, which is probably around $99 or so on. And the reason is because they are running it on a platform where they have access to only certain set of genetic information. They do on a chip-based technology, which is basically giving information to only 700,000 genetic markers. And that's the reason why it's very limited information. What we do at CircleDNA is we run it at a technology which is called as whole exome sequencing. What this basically means is that there are certain protein coding regions of our DNA, which is what gives us all this information about your diet, about your fitness, about your cancer risk. Everything is pretty much involved in this protein coding region. And when we sequence this whole region, we can get access to a lot of information with a much better, I would say, prediction ability, and also with much higher quality as well. This whole exome sequencing is expensive, and that's the reason why we are being able to bring down the cost in a way that the end user can still get the benefit of the whole extensive testing, and also get information of around 31 million genetic markers compared to 700,000 what other companies do.
Wow, gosh, that's huge. And if you do the genetic testing with you, do you do the whole thing, or just do the medical or the prenatal or the, I guess you can choose what you want, can't you?
Yeah, you can choose what you want. So we do have different products which are catered towards people who want to just to know about their diet and fitness. They can do something which is called as Vital, the first entry product or panel. And the second one is basically family planning, which also involves diet, fitness, and all of that, but also gives you access to certain kind of family planning conditions results. And then we have something which is called as CircleDNA Premium, which is having everything, right? Which is about cancer, brain health, family planning, drug responses, and also fitness, and also diet, and also different traits like creativity or different kind of aspects like sleep. And all of this are pretty much covered under the whole product of CircleDNA Premium. And I was mentioning that exome platform is basically focusing on the protein coding regions. But if you look at the overall costing, which was, I would say, initially in the year 2003, when they first released the first human DNA sequence results, the cost was around $1.2 billion. So can you imagine?
What?
Yeah, that was the cost for the DNA sequence. And I guess Steve Jobs was one of the guys who actually got it initially. It was very interesting that how the cost has dropped down to a level where anybody can actually buy it. And you can go online and just buy it for 2,000 or 2,500 Hong Kong dollars and so on.
Yeah, that's very reasonable, isn't it, for all the information that you get? That's amazing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And all of them are pretty much going to help you in the journey of wellness and health. So I think it's totally a worth product, especially for people who are very much cautious about their health.
Yeah, that's brilliant. You mentioned earlier about ancestry DNA testing.
Mm-hmm.
What is it and how does it work?
Oh, yeah. So this is also a kind of testing that we also do. And this is covered in most of the products which we actually test for. And ancestry DNA testing is basically to understand where your ancestral roots come from. So many of the people might be aware that all these companies who test for, they actually give an information about what percentage of ancestry you might actually be inheriting from your ancestors. Some companies basically look for certain markers pretty much pertaining to European ancestry and so on. But yes, we also look for a global database where we can tell people how much ethnic percentage that they might have from certain region, let's say from Europe, which part of Europe, and also from, let's say they are from South Asia, let's say how much percentage of Malay or how much percent of Indonesian. All of this is basically based on the genetic markers, which we also call as tag markers. These are the ones which are very specific to certain ethnic groups when they might have migrated across the world through different processes like invasions, or they might be colonizations. So all of that actually have left some footprints across the different regions. And these footprints are actually the genetic markers because they have been breeding in certain areas and so on. People have evolved, and that's when you can actually track all these different ethnicity roots just based on the DNA. And this is what helps people to know what actually their composition is.
It's so interesting, isn't it, to find out what your makeup. Yeah. I got mine done through 23andMe, and it was very interesting to see the UK and the European composition. And then my daughter got hers done, and it was very interesting to see all the things that she had that are obviously from her father's side and not from mine. So, it's fascinating. It said in your bio that you're into product development. What sort of developing are you doing?
When we put across products like this to the market, right, we have to do a background research because there is so much of data, there is so much of research that goes into the overall everyday, day-to-day process. Research publishers have been publishing in the scientific community. We do have to try and vet these papers, and then we have to use those specific markers which are very relevant to the condition. And then we try and basically articulate in a way that it is useful for the end user and what makes actually sense in terms of the data perspective. That's the reason why we have to basically be involved and be well ahead in terms of this field to try and use scientific data into a way that the scientific community as well as the overall, I would say, general public can also use this data to get more insights into their own health.
What can we expect in the future when it comes to genetic testing?
I think this is a very interesting question because at this point of time, I feel not many people are aware about DNA or genetic testing as such. I guess after COVID-19, many people started to understand what DNA is or what mutation is actually. But yes, I feel in future, it would be so common or so important that everybody, the moment they are born, I think they will be tested for certain DNA tests. For sure, because many of the conditions can be pretty much prevented and you can actually get to know what predisposition they might have. So all of these specific details would be a very common norm, I feel. And I think eventually it should pretty much get quite an establishment in the healthcare from mine. That was one of the reasons also why I actually got more into this field because I watched this movie called Gattaca. And this was this was one of the starters, I would say, in terms of how it actually got me more interested into this field. Because when I watched that movie, I was like, this is nowhere close to what it could be at this point of time. But still, we are heading towards it. Because in that movie where they show like everyone who is born, they are actually tested for their genes. And they are actually told in advance what are the conditions that they might be predisposed to, which is exactly where we're heading towards. And the more we know, the lesser the burden on the healthcare system. Because if you see currently, even for COVID-19, all the healthcare system is pretty much disrupted. There is no enough beds, there is no ventilators because there are so many people who are actually turning out to be positive, and it's completely disrupting. I think the same way, if we don't take care of our health, there will be more burden on the global health, and people, if they don't take preemptive or preventive measures, definitely it's going to disrupt the healthcare as well. The same concept, but in a different context.
I wanted to ask you about CBD oil and whether you know anything about that. Do you feel like it's like, for me, in the research that I've done and the people that I know that are using it, it seems like it's a wonder drug. And I think there's a lot of big pharma companies that don't want to have it getting onto the system because it's going to help people with their general health. You put the pharma companies and the pill industry out of business. And I feel like that along with all this genetic testing and this DNA understanding, the value of CBD oil as something that can work for so many different conditions, whether it's epilepsy or arthritis or anxiety. It seems like it works for so many different things. Do you think I am correct, or do you think I'm making it up?
Well, it's a very interesting question, actually. And there have been some people who have asked me this question. And I definitely feel there is a huge potential, which we still haven't discovered, in terms of how CBD can actually help in terms of overall health, not only for mental health, as you mentioned, because I was also watching this interesting documentary of Deepak Chopra. He actually did the same kind of research from a general user's perspective, where he found out how CBD can actually help people, especially kids who were having epileptic seizures. And then when they started taking the CBD oil in the food or anything, their seizures usually used to be around 40 per day. And then it got reduced to only 5 or 3 per day, which is crazy. If you look at it, it's pretty much changed the whole life of the kid. There are huge potentials. I think it could be pretty much involved in many of the drugs in future. I do see it to be a wonder drug.
Yeah, I do too. My brother-in-law was having blackouts, not seizures, but blackouts, sometimes 4 a week, and they couldn't identify what it was from. And eventually he started taking CBD oil, and he's gone like 17 months without a blackout. They think it's a brain injury from rugby, quite possibly, like the American footballers get, and that doesn't get diagnosed till after they die. But it's been incredible how it's worked for him. So, it's really, really amazing.
Yeah, I'm sure. Like, even like they say about THC, which is, of course, causing more hallucination or, other side effects. But I feel even THC has a huge benefit. We still haven't understood in detail.
Well, it can certainly help cancer patients with pain, and it can help increase appetite. And CBD oil can help Parkinson's and multiple sclerosis and osteoarthritis and anxiety. And oh my God, like that's the future. Yeah, it is. It's an endless list. Anyway, I've deviated off my questions completely. Let's get back to CRISPR technology. We hear about that, and how can it be relevant in the coming years? What is it?
Oh, yes. CRISPR is a very interesting technology. We just got into the news, I would say quite a few years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And it's a technology where you can actually edit your DNA. This is very interesting. So it's basically like, let's say, in layman words, I would say, if you're opening a Word document when you're writing a sentence, and if you want to edit something in between a word, you can just click on that specific point with your mouse, and then you want to backspace it. It's the same concept with CRISPR, where you can actually edit your own DNA sequence in a way that you can pretty much avoid the conditions from being progressed into the person, prenatal stage. I mean, when the developmental phase of the baby, when the baby is actually growing. This is some of the techniques which have actually come into the notice. And of course, at this point of time, it's not ethical. It's not legal to do. But I do see that in future, there will be many applications of this where you can actually try and integrate into the society so that you can avoid many of the conditions be diagnosed in people.
What do you say then to people who say, oh, but it's all God's plan and we're meant to go with what the Lord has given us and stuff like that? What do you say to that? And before you answer, I'm atheist, so go ahead and apologies to any of my listeners who are not. But We're all different. We're a diverse community.
I mean, I would put it in a very diplomatic way because I would like to understand from every individual's perspective. For those people, who think, this is a God's given thing. And, but I would say that when you see a child actually being diagnosed with very serious condition, it's actually not only trauma in terms of the overall mental health for the parents, but also it's very crazy in terms of how you have to take care of the whole child with different problems. And also financially, it's a big burden. These are the things which you only experience when somebody actually goes through it. That's the reason why I feel this technology can actually help people in future, let's say whenever it comes, to avoid these scenarios. And imagine if you tend to not have a serious condition from happening to a child, you're literally saving the whole life of the child.
And changing the direction of the life of the parent by meaning that they're not in financial and emotional stress and difficulty for many years. Does make sense. And there's so many things in the world that we try to mitigate danger or change opportunities. So like we're trying to shut down COVID and things like that. The whole God's plan argument doesn't really work if you look at the whole picture. Anyway, please don't write in and criticize me for my...
No, I think it's a very valid question from what you asked. I think from a general perspective, it's very beneficial. But if you look at it, of course, there is downsides of it. Like, some people who are very rich or the elite group of people, they might want to design their babies as well. Like, if they want to have guys, or let's say they want their kids to be really tall. Now, that's where I feel you need to draw a line and have some regulators and some ethics boards who can actually place certain laws into place so that not have access to certain technology that can help them in their favor. Main concept is to try and make it more equal and equally accessible for everyone, but stop the harmful side.
Yeah, the designer baby, or it becoming like a thing to make more beautiful people or more
exactly
people. Yeah. It's danger, isn't it?
It's
pretty much what a lot of people want.
Yeah,
a lot of people are doing it to themselves with cosmetic surgery, but that's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, right. If you see even the back in Hitler days, right? They used to talk about this specific kind of things, right?
Blue-eyed blonde children. You're right. Which neither of us fit into at all.
Right.
How is the work that you do here in Hong Kong different to the work that you've done in other companies around the world?
Yeah, I have worked in Malaysia. I was in Kuala Lumpur for 2 years. I worked in Singapore, and then before that I was in India. It's very different. Like the market is very different. Like how people think about health is very different. But of course, the end benefit is pretty much the same. But the setting that I was working was very different because when I was working in Malaysia and Singapore, I was mainly liaising with physicians and healthcare workers and helping the clients or patients who actually came to the clinics or hospital. But here it's very different. What I work in Hong Kong is direct to consumers. It's like anybody who are not even having any condition can still get the DNA test, and we can still help them to lead a much healthier and personalized way of living towards wellness.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
And do you have a story that you can share about how genetic testing has positively impacted one of your clients' lives?
I have many stories, but I can probably put across two of them. One of them is definitely a story of one individual who has a strong family history for heart conditions. Now, this is one of the fields where I didn't touch initially, but this is an example where he's a sportsman and he has this one specific genetic mutation in this gene called SCN5A, which is actually associated with how your overall heartbeat rates could actually vary, and also what kind of problems that might be relating to the overall issues like palpitations or leading to certain chest pain and all of that. All of these scenarios could eventually lead to death, like sudden death, which many people will not even have any initial symptoms. And especially for people who have these genetic mutations, if they do any extra, I would say crazy kind of workouts, or if they're actually doing some strenuous activities, they could immediately drop like dead. And that's the reason why, if you see, even there are some stories where sportsmen actually can die on the fields, especially in football fields and so on. This is a condition which is called as HCM, which is called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. This is where DNA testing can help you know whether you're at risk for it and how you can avoid it by understanding what are the things that you should not be doing. And also you can have constant screenings from your cardiologist. And you can actually do certain MRIs for your heart. And all of them can actually help you understand whether you are someone at a higher risk or not. You can totally avoid somebody.
So you can avoid death, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
These are some of the cases that I have seen many times. Not necessarily you need to have a family history. You can still have the mutation. And it's basically like a ticking time bomb, which you do not know, and it's going to, blast. So that's the reason why genetic testing can help you kind of diffuse this bomb.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing. Did you have one other story you wanted to share?
Yeah, one other story, yes, of course, which is with very common problem which many women tend to face, not only women but also men, which is breast cancer specifically, I would say, because as I mentioned, all those genes which could increase the risk of breast cancer. If you see, even let's say for coming back to the same story of Angelina Jolie, if you tend to have a mutation in any of the breast cancer genes, then you can have an increased risk for breast cancer up to 70 to 80%, which is like massive.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah. And in general, I would say population, the risk is around 10%. So if you have a mutation, you straight away go to 70 to 80%. And you can straight away cut down that risk if you tend to follow certain lifestyle measures and also the screening. And if, let's say, if it's very strong family history, you can also do certain prophylactic surgeries, which I mentioned earlier, which is for some people, it could be double mastectomy if family history is very strong on breast cancer. If they have very strong family history of ovarian cancer, then they can do actually oophorectomy or even get to do some other surgeries, which can also remove the fallopian tubes and so on. All of this can definitely reduce the risk. And also there are certain drugs which can also work more effectively if you tend to have a mutation. Now that is very interesting. If you, let's say, know that you have a mutation in this specific gene, certain drugs might actually work better for you to cut down the underlying, I would say, risk of chemotherapy side effects or other kind of effects. Yeah.
Wow. Oh, that's so cool. That's really interesting. I think I might have to get a test done. If I want to do the test, how do I do it?
So you basically can go to CircleDNA.com, like that's the website, and you can actually place an order. It's very simple. And once you do that, we send out a saliva kit, which will come to your house and which is inclusive of the cost. And then we also do a pickup. This is something simple test where you just need to use the cotton swab and you need to rub it inside your cheeks. Just put it into the container and then keep it ready. And then the guys will come and pick it up. And once it comes to a lab, we basically take around 2 to 3 weeks. And then you pretty much get the whole results in your app. And that's pretty much simple.
Oh. Gee, that's amazing. So user-friendly.
Yeah, very user-friendly.
Yeah. And if I have a test done now, will I need to repeat it in the future or do you just need to get it done once?
Right. If you're doing a test like 23andMe or let's say a test like Ancestry.com, as I mentioned earlier, the set of information that you get is very limited. But yeah, underlying genetics, what you inherited from your parents is going to stay the same for the rest of your life. That's the reason why only the differentiating factor is the technology that you use. So if you're using our whole exome sequencing platform, you will have a lot of information. You can actually use this data to not only understand about your health, but other avenues of genetic testing as well. That's pretty much how it will be very effective, but it's a one-time test. You don't have to do it again and again.
Arun, thank you so much for talking about genetics and coming on the podcast. It's been so interesting, like absolutely fascinating. It's been great.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you. And I definitely love every episode of yours. I have, heard many of them. It's very diverse, very intense, and I love.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. It's great. Yeah. So, for my listeners out there, if you've really enjoyed this podcast, would you please rate and review it on iTunes to help Hong Kong Confidential go up the charts, but also help people learn more about CircleDNA and genetic testing, and people then be able to contact CircleDNA to get their own genetic tests as well. And if you want to sponsor me on Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/Hong Kong Confidential. And for as little as $1 a month, you can hear the answers to my guest secret questions. Now, Arun, you didn't know about this, but I'm going to ask you 4 secret questions now.
Sure,
and that's going to go on my Patreon page. So for the people that sponsor me, they get a little bit of extra interview with you. So,
nice.
So we're going to say goodbye now and thank you so much. And we're going to head on over to Patreon. So thank you so much, Arun. It's been absolutely fascinating. I've loved it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Jules.
Hi, Confidants. I want to tell you about my Patreon page. I've joined Patreon in the hope of getting sponsorship for my Hong Kong Confidential podcast. Patreon is a great way for my listeners to get on board and sponsor me with monthly payments, and that goes towards my production costs and rewards for my members. If you're interested in checking out my Patreon page, please go to patreon.com and search up Jules Hannaford or Hong Kong Confidential. I would really appreciate you visiting my page. So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.